Welcome to the Reese and Dennis podcast about the Second Industrial Revolution, which lasted around 1870 to 1914.
The topics we will be talking about are our advancements in new industries, how Germany became an industrial rival to Great Britain, the advancements of transportation and communication affecting trade and migration.
Additionally, we'll be talking about the dangers of the industrial life, reactions to industrialization, capitalism and socialism, and the ways industrialization impacted imperialism. So, what industries advanced during this time?
Well, one industry that advanced during this time was steel. Steel was used to replace iron to make things like ships, railroads, and factory work. Up to the Second Industrial Revolution, steel was very expensive. In 1855, Henry Bessemer found a solution to have steel mass produced. By 1870, it was used for ship plates and steel railways. Then there was the Siemens-Martin process, and it lowered the price of steel more than ever in recycled waste. It was the lead steel-making process in the 20th century. It allowed for larger bridges, railroads, and skyscrapers.
Oh, I heard chemicals were an important industry too. They made more effective fertilizers for farming, and dynamite changed the way people mined. Sodium carbonate and sulfuric acid were chemicals that led to parts of new inventions.
I also heard electricity was used to create new sources of communication, light, and transportation. Alexander Graham Bell created the telephone in 1876, which improved communication in cities. Thomas Edison invented the first light bulb that was practical for home use. It was safe and not expensive. This also allowed factories to stay going during the night so they could have workers all the time. The first electric railroad appeared in Berlin, Germany as early as 1880. Electric streetcars began to replace horse-drawn carriages in major European cities. Giulio Marconi sent radio waves across the Atlantic Ocean for the first time. So how did Germany become an industrial rival to Great Britain?
To rival Britain, Germany first had spies look at British factories and replicate the machinery to make their own products. Germany then tried to spread bad products by making them say they were made in Britain.
So they would almost try to spread rumors about Britain.
Yes, and in retaliation, the British required all imported goods to include a stamp that had its host nation name on it. This was a discreet way of stopping the Germans from making fake items and falsely stamping them that they were British made.
Well, did it work?
No, in fact, the made in Germany stamp ended up backfiring on the British, as German industrial technology was already more advanced than Great Britain's, resulting in the made in Germany stamp to be a sign of quality. This helped promote German industry. How did advancements in transportation and communication affect trade and migration?
The advancement of transportation and communication allowed for factories not having to be near a water source. More canals were built so people could get ships from one place to another.
What would be an example of canals built during this time?
An example of this would be the Panama Canal built in the early 1900s. This would be to help U.S. transport goods from east to west. Another big thing was the rural to urban migration, as the population was mostly living in the city now due to not needing the farming to live. Also, Europe and Chinese immigrants went to the U.S. looking for work.
Where did the immigrants go to the U.S.?
They would go to Ellis Island in New York and Angel Island in California to get into the U.S. Britain and the U.S. would also go to places in South America and develop part of the countries with railroads connecting them to farms to get volunteers living as a poor person during this time.
There was a lot of overcrowding. There were many people living together in tenements that had no source of plumbing or any sort of sanitary things, so it led to disease, which caused a lot of deaths. Along with poor working conditions. These working conditions in factories were awful. People would work long hours and machines were very dangerous with no safety measures. Also, mining was very dangerous. Life as a factory worker or as a miner was not very enjoyable or safe. Child labor was also prevalent. Factories used children as they worked for cheaper wages. Children's brains had not fully developed yet, and they had to work machines that were very dangerous. Children would die in the most gruesome ways. In the canning industry in Maryland, there was a submission saying that children should not work in factories because they were too young. Pollution became a huge issue during this time. Air pollution rose due to factories. Coal and iron ore burned to run steam engines and petroleum to use to run cars. Sewer systems that were built polluted the other water sources in the city. This led to diseases such as typhoid and cholera. How did people react to industrialization?
Well, there's a big thing with women's suffrage. Women, the rich and middle class, thought they should have some say in the government to vote and then further women's rights. In 1869, they started the National Women's Suffrage Association by Lucy Stone. Other activists like Susan B. Anthony pushed for women's rights to vote.
How long did it take for women to finally be able to vote in the United States?
It took about until 1920 women were finally able to vote. Public education was also a huge thing during this time. In Europe, 1880, there was an Education Act that required kids by law to go to school up until 10. This kept little kids away from child labor, which was very dangerous. In 1902 Education Act, they set up secondary schooling. This could help poor kids get an education and go on to do more skilled work than working in poor working condition factories.
What is secondary schooling?
This is like middle school and high school in the U.S.
Did they add more universities?
Yes, in Europe they added red brick universities, which were more on science. Labor movements were a huge thing during this time. Unions were legalized in 1871 with the Trade Union Act. One person could not go on strike because obviously they would get replaced as many were on the streets. Also during this time, it was a laissez-faire capitalism, which meant the government barely messed with the factory. These groups would form unions and protest to have better working conditions, which worked sometimes.
Why could these people have to go through so much to get better working conditions?
Well, a lot of the factory and mine workers became immigrants, and they were willing to work in these conditions for poverty wages that they had nowhere else to work. What's the difference between capitalism and socialism?
Capitalism is an economic system that has private ownership. At this time, people would invest in their factories, paying for raw materials, equipment, and wages to people. They would get all the profits they made back. Most of the time, people who back capitalism were of the middle class. Socialism is an economic system that controls the means of production, distribution, and exchange, and is run by the state. The government controls all property, production, and distribution to make sure everyone gets equal benefits. Much of the support of socialism came from the lower class industrial workers looking to get back on the middle class.
Oh wow, that is very interesting.
How did industrialization affect imperialism during this time?
Industrialization had a huge effect on imperialism. Countries needed more raw materials, so they needed to exploit and colonize to get these materials. They had mostly colonized in the Caribbean and Africa. Places like Britain had used up a lot of their raw materials, like trees, so they went to Africa to get materials like oil and forest products to use. In Africa, this was called the Scrambled Africa, which led eventually to the Berlin Conference in 1884 to divide who got which parts of Africa to get raw materials. This was due to countries fighting over the lands in Africa.
What would happen to people who were living in those countries?
They would get moved based on where they lived, so some would get separated from their family and friends. To conclude our podcast on the Second Industrial Revolution, there were many positive negatives. It added new inventions, new ways to transport and communicate. There was also a rise in public education and labor movements to help working conditions. With that, there was pollution, overcrowding, bad conditions in tenements and factories, and little kids that had to work in these factories. Also, women were fighting their right to vote. Lastly, a lot of countries in Africa were exploited for materials.
Thank you for watching our podcast on the Second Industrial Revolution.